What if I told you that the fall of this small Ukrainian town could be the first domino in a chain that ends in World War III? In July of 2025, Russian forces executed a near total encirclement of Pokrovsk, a small town in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. On the surface, it's a forgettable town in a forgotten corner of a forgotten war. But for those paying attention to the larger game, it's a crucial domino in a sequence that leads somewhere far more dangerous. You see, Pokrovsk isn't meaningless. It's a fortress sitting along a vital supply line. Together with Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk, it forms the backbone of Ukrainian defenses. So its loss would not just rattle Ukraine's already strained supply lines, it would disrupt America's grand plan for world domination. That strategy is called strategic sequencing, a doctrine designed to keep Russia bogged down in Ukraine so that the US can pivot, first to Persia, then to China, in a desperate effort to maintain its supremacy. But like many war plans, this one has backfired. Instead of Russia being trapped, it is the US that finds itself stuck. Western resources are bleeding into Ukraine. This is why Pokrovsk matters, because every Ukrainian town that falls to Russia delays this American pivot. These small towns are pressure points on a global war map, and defending them doesn't just exhaust weapons, money, or manpower. It exhausts the most precious resource in America's arsenal: time. In this video, we'll explore the American strategy of fighting one opponent at a time, how its enemies are undermining this plan, and why every setback brings the US one step closer to the nightmare it's trying to avoid, which is fighting everyone at the same time. This video is sponsored by the United States Treasury Department. As you know, the national debt has exploded to the point of no return. This is due to poor fiscal policy and corruption in the military-industrial complex, which has enjoyed decades of limitless increases to their budget. Every time the national debt increases, the value of the dollar decreases, which threatens the future of you and your children, because the value of your savings are eaten away by the inflation debt spiral that the Fed cannot gain control of. And the corporations that continue to loot the US Treasury refuse to pay their fair share of taxes, despite reporting record profits. So the burden to reduce the debt has now been placed on your shoulders. The Federal Reserve has announced that they are accepting donations from the public to help reduce the debt. It's called the Gifts to Reduce the Public Debt Program. Now, even though you already pay taxes, they want you to voluntarily pay more so they can waste it on their endless wars for Israel and imperialism. So if you're feeling patriotic and incredibly stupid, use my code I'mADumbass to spend your hard-earned money on the endless pit of quicksand that is our national debt. All jokes aside, our channel is too controversial to receive any sort of sponsorship, so I'm counting on you to help me sustain this channel. So instead of donating to the Federal Reserve, which is a real thing by the way, you can donate to me instead. Click the link in the description and visit my website to support our investigative reporting and analysis. Now back to the video. The United States has a problem. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has enjoyed undisputed dominance as the global hegemon, the empire that made all the rules and broke them, a world order built in its image, and one that has overwhelmingly served its interests. But drunk on power, America's ruling class fell asleep at the wheel. Over the last 30 years, rival powers have risen quietly, deliberately, each chipping away at the illusion of unipolarity. In Europe, Russia clawed its way back from the brink. Instead of fracturing into micro-states, the Russian Federation survived a wave of proxy wars, consolidated its borders, and re-emerged as a respectable player under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. And instead of allowing NATO to expand unchecked into Georgia and Ukraine, Russia drew a line and then crossed it. In the Middle East, Iran endured decades of sanctions, assassinations, and isolation to emerge as a powerful military and technological power. With one of the world's most advanced arsenals of ballistic missiles, a regional network of non-state allies capable of asymmetric warfare and economic disruption, and a nuclear program now just steps away from weaponization. As a result, they've been able to disrupt US and Israeli designs for regional hegemony. And in Asia, China rose from poverty to superpower superpower status. It now dominates entire industrial sectors, from automobiles to semiconductors to advanced weaponry. It is the beating heart of global manufacturing. Its economic gravity is so strong that even Washington's strongest allies, Japan, South Korea, Germany, cannot sever ties, even as they prepare for a confrontation. So today, American primacy faces simultaneous challenges: Russia in Eastern Europe, Iran in the Middle East, and China in the Pacific. The US wants to reassert its global dominance, but this is a very bad time for a multi-front war, because the world simply isn't what it used to be. The US military is exhausted after decades of disastrous wars. Its economy has been hollowed out by Wall Street's financialization and outsourcing of industry. Factories were shipped overseas in pursuit of profit, many of them to China. And now, the strength of the US economy rests not on production, but on the perceived stability of the dollar. And the dollar's strength depends on the world's belief in American power, which is just another way of saying its military dominance. But that dominance is now being challenged economically, militarily, and strategically by Iran, Russia, and China. The US wants to stop them, but it can't take them all on at once. According to Elbridge Colby, a key architect of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and author of The Strategy of Denial, this is the harsh reality. America's military is not structured to deter simultaneous conflict with China, Russia, and Iran. We must choose. That single sentence is telling. It means that the US isn't trying to avoid conflict. It's being selective about who to fight first. And that brings us to the core of Washington's strategy. Russia first, then Iran, then China. Instead of fighting everyone at once, the US is trying to fight its competitors in isolation, one-on-one at a time and place of its own choosing. This is strategic sequencing, and it's built on an important truth. No superpower, no matter how mighty, can fight everyone at once. So the idea is to focus your power, to concentrate your strength against one adversary, break their momentum, and then pivot to the next. Because power, even for empires, is limited. It's constrained by distance, by money, by public will, by time. If you try to fight all of your enemies simultaneously, one of two things happens. You get stretched too thin and suffer a catastrophic defeat. Or you spend your nation into exhaustion, waging endless wars in all directions, bleeding your economy and your society dry. So instead, a smart power manipulates the clock. It buys time. It staggers the threats, and it handles them in sequence before they can unite or become too powerful on their own. This strategy of sequencing isn't new. It's ancient. It's what great powers have always done. The Athenians struck a 5-year truce with Sparta, not because they wanted a lasting peace, but because they needed to fight other enemies and strengthen their position. Byzantine emperors used it to avoid fighting the Huns, the Persians, and the Vandals all at once. The Habsburgs sequenced their wars against the Bourbons, the Prussians, and the Ottomans. And even Britain bought time for their showdown with Germany by settling its rivalries with France and Russia first. So this is what great powers have always done. They sequence the battles with their enemies deliberately. So again, the US isn't trying to avoid conflict. They are delaying it in different arenas so they can fight who they want, when and where they want to, in a way that gives them the best chance for success. By expanding NATO deep into Eastern Europe and openly recruiting Ukraine to join the alliance, the United States believed it had set a trap for Russia. Washington understood that Moscow might take the bait and try to stop their expansion, which would bog them down in the mud of war, just as it had done in Afghanistan decades earlier, when the US used the Mujahideen to degrade and exhaust Soviet forces. History remembers the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a catastrophic war that depleted morale and exhausted the treasury, contributing to the collapse of the empire as a whole. So the calculation was simple. Russia would either stand down and watch NATO plant weapons on its doorstep, or it would invade and walk into a carefully laid kill box. In that scenario, the US would choke it with sanctions and help Ukraine fight in order to force another humiliating defeat. From the Pentagon's perspective, it was a win-win strategy for the US. Either way, they would be in control of the situation. Now, as we all know, Russia decided to invade. The assumption in Washington was that Russia would crumble militarily, economically, politically, but that didn't happen. After initially failing to topple Ukraine in a blitzkrieg, Russia adjusted. It pivoted to a war of attrition, stretching out its war goals over a period of several years. And instead of suffering economic collapse, it restructured its economy, deepened its ties with China and Iran, and built new pathways around Western sanctions. And with nowhere else to park their capital, Russian oligarchs and billionaires were forced to reinvest their money at home, fueling an unexpected boom in domestic manufacturing and development. In less than 2 years, Russia had become the fastest growing economy in Europe, overtaking Germany. Defense manufacturing was reorganized and scaled up at a pace the West didn't see coming. So yeah, Russia took the bait, but they did it on their own terms, advancing slowly in Ukraine while hardening their economy. So the US thought it had trapped Russia in a quagmire, but the Russians played to their own strengths and embraced the grind. Now, it's not Russia that's stuck in Ukraine, it's the United States and its allies. Despite pouring billions into Ukraine, the Russian advance hasn't stalled. More than 3 years in, Moscow appears stronger and more united than ever. The hundreds of billions of dollars in munitions, engineering support, and training that were supposed to exhaust Russia are now draining NATO instead. And at this point in time, it appears that Russia has the clear, overwhelming advantage. And it's because of two simple things: willpower and logistics. You see, for Russia, this is an existential war on their borders. For the West, it's a distant conflict, thousands of miles away, with no sense of urgency, no appetite for true wartime mobilization. The Ukraine war may be crucial to Western supremacy, but it isn't crucial to their survival, and that's an important difference. So even though NATO and the West have an economic and military bloc that dwarfs Russia in population and GDP, the West remains half in, half out, reluctant to fully commit. They've given Ukraine enough to keep fighting, but not enough to win, and certainly not enough to halt Russia's advance. Apart from the occasional raids on Russian air bases, terror attacks on beaches or concert halls, and brief incursions into lightly defended territory, Ukraine has secured no lasting deterrent on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Russia continues to grind forward, slowly, methodically, wearing down Ukrainian defenses and draining its precious manpower. If this war continues at its current pace, it's only a matter of time before Russia breaks through Ukraine's defensive lines and rapidly expands its territorial control. The only way to stop that outcome is to flood Ukraine with even more resources, money, weapons, manpower, and fighter jets like the F-16. But doing that means Washington can't pivot to the other targets they have sequenced. It can't shift resources or attention towards Iran and China. That is why the US now wants to hit pause, to freeze the conflict where it stands. This is why Donald Trump campaigned heavily on peace during his presidential run. Not because he's anti-war, but because his advisors knew that halting the conflict, even temporarily, is the only way to pivot towards Asia with full force. So in short, Moscow currently has the upper hand. Their strategy is working, their military position is improving, their economy is holding. So why would Russia agree to pause? Why would they give the US a chance to reorganize and rearm Ukraine while it chips away at their allies in Asia and the Middle East, only to return later and start the war again? So from Russia's perspective, it makes sense to finish the job while the odds are in their favor. Simply put, the Russians aren't interested in settling for less when they are in a position to take everything they want by force. This is why the US is now doubling down on the war in Ukraine, because now the only way to settle the war is on the battlefield. Washington and its allies now promise to escalate support to reverse losses, regain leverage, and force a negotiated settlement from a position of strength. This is also why Donald Trump has shifted from peacenik to warhawk, threatening escalation because, according to him, Putin refuses to negotiate. Trump wants a ceasefire on American terms, a strategic pause to allow the US to rearm, redeploy, and pivot towards the Indo-Pacific, where the greater competitor is waiting. But Russia refuses to cooperate. Moscow is demanding a ceasefire on their terms, which includes territorial concessions and guarantees against future NATO expansion. The US wants a frozen conflict with a defensible Ukrainian front line, a permanent buffer zone in Eastern Europe, what they call a glacis shield, a wall against Russian influence. In essence, Washington wants Ukraine to hold the line just long enough so the US can shift its gaze east. But every time a town like Pokrovsk falls, that hope crumbles. Every lost city demands more reinforcements, more weapons, more funding, just to avoid total collapse. Now, you might assume NATO can easily absorb this cost. It is a 32-nation alliance after all. Surely the burden can be shared. But two problems stand in the way. Europe doesn't seem to have the will, and even if they did, this isn't just about money, it's about production. You see, more than a decade ago, NATO members agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. But it took them years before most even attempted to meet that goal. By 2021, 7 years after the pledge, only 6 out of 30 members had actually reached the threshold of 2% GDP spending. And as of 2025, 9 NATO members still fall short. And now, NATO members have pledged to raise the bar again, agreeing to increase the spending target from 2% to 5%. And the reason is simple. The US doesn't expect this war to end anytime soon, and it refuses to concede defeat. But it still needs to pivot. So Washington wants Europe to carry more of the burden so it can shift focus toward Iran and China without leaving Ukraine exposed and losing ground in Eastern Europe. So this 3% increase is meant to lock Europe into the Ukraine war, boost manpower, and scale up weapons production, enough to hold a defensive line in Eastern Europe and slow the Russian advance. But it took a decade to reach the 2% pledge. So how long will it take to reach 5%, especially as Europe wrestles with inflation, economic decline, and political unrest? And even if the money does arrive on time, a bigger issue looms: industrial output. The West simply cannot produce weapons fast enough, not to keep Ukraine fighting, and certainly not enough to replenish their own depleted stockpiles. There are two types of weapons that reveal the scope of this problem: artillery shells and air defense missiles. Let's start with artillery. The 155mm shell has been the lifeblood of this war. Ukraine fires around 2,000 artillery shells per day. Russia fires 5 to 10 times that amount. This disparity has produced Russian dominance on the battlefield, as they are able to soften defenses before storming positions and gaining territory. Ukraine simply cannot compete with these numbers. They need more to have any chance on the battlefield. So the US has been forced to ramp up production just to sustain the levels Ukraine can fire each day. After 3 years of war, billions of dollars of investment, and the supposed urgency of this conflict, the US can only expect to hit 100,000 shells per month by the end of 2025. That's right, the US isn't even producing that amount now. The Russians, on the other hand, are already producing 250 to 300,000 shells per month at a fraction of the cost. Closing this gap in production is crucial, but it isn't as simple as throwing money at the problem, because you can't just flip the switch and turn on a factory. It takes years of investment and training, and it doesn't seem that the US or Western Europe is taking this issue seriously. Then there's air defense. Despite massive support from NATO, Ukraine is rapidly running out of interceptor missiles. Russian drones and missile barrages are eroding what's left night after night. The number of interceptor missiles have been waning faster and faster. Russia now enjoys near complete dominance over the skies of Ukraine, which is encouraging them to fire even more missiles and drones. And the situation worsened after the Iran-Israel war. Consider this fact. Since 2010, the Pentagon has purchased 650 THAAD missiles. During the 12-day war, Israel burned through 150 of these THAAD interceptor missiles. So in just 12 days, Israel exhausted nearly a quarter of all the THAAD missiles produced over the last 15 years. Quote, The war revealed an alarming gap in US supplies. "We are at long last waking up to the need for massive defensive munitions procurement," said Tom Carrico, director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Vice Admiral Brad Cooper told Congress in June that officials need to move with a sense of urgency. Quote, "I'm concerned about everything, but one of the concerns would be munitions and magazine depth," Cooper said. "It would likely take more than a year and cost between 1.5 and 2 billion to replenish the THAAD interceptors fired during the 12-day war," according to Wes Rumbaugh, a CSIS fellow who researches Pentagon missile procurement and budget details. This is why Israel sued for peace despite not meeting any of its goals in Iran, because it simply could not sustain continued conflict. And this is why the US has been trying to sequence their conflicts. They cannot produce enough weaponry to fight and win multiple wars at the same time. Because unlike the last few decades of war, the US isn't fighting weak opponents like Iraq, the Taliban, or the lightly armed groups in Syria or Yemen. They are waging war against industrial powers. So Ukraine is depleting NATO's arsenals faster than they can replace them. Israel demands urgent resupply, and all the while, China is rapidly producing weapons for a potential showdown in the Pacific over Taiwan. So while sequencing may be a reasonable strategy in theory, the US has utterly failed in executing it thus far. The US is stretched thin, NATO is dragging its feet, Russia is winning, Iran still stands, and China has yet to see a single bullet fired toward them. And it isn't looking good, because even if the US were to produce more weapons, what it cannot produce is more time, and time is running out. Because while Russia and Iran are important adversaries to deal with, the ultimate threat to American hegemony is China. They are the true near-peer competitor, the one target the US must contain to preserve its global dominance. But Washington can't even pivot off of their Russian or Iranian targets to even begin to try and contain China. Despite the recent trade wars, the Chinese economy continues to rise. China is now the undisputed largest industrial juggernaut in the history of mankind. According to the US Navy, China's shipbuilding capacity is over 200 times that of the US. In 2023, China delivered 972 commercial ships. The US delivered just 7. And this is just shipbuilding. China is advancing production across the board, from vehicles to bullets, bombs, drones, jets, and missiles. Quote, "The People's Liberation Army was, and still is, bulking up quickly with weapons, reforms, and exercises that could enable an invasion of Taiwan." With this backdrop, the Senate asked Admiral Phil Davidson, the retiring head of the US Indo-Pacific Command, whether that changed the odds of a conflict around Taiwan. Quote, "The threat is manifest during this decade, in the next 6 years. That threat will manifest in 2027. And even if the war doesn't occur by then, the US will still be pressed for time. Because according to the Department of Defense, by 2035, the modernization of its armed forces should be basically complete. By 2049, China will have a world-class military. The US has responded by increasing spending in the Indo-Pacific, but it cannot hope to meet China's industrial scale unless it pulls back from Europe and the Middle East. And that can't happen because Iran is still a powerful threat and Russia continues to win, one Ukrainian town at a time. This is why the encirclement of little towns like Pokrovsk matters, because every loss on the Ukrainian battlefield is time lost on the clock. And this is dangerous because every delay makes the threat of a larger, more catastrophic war possible. You see, the entire point of strategic sequencing is not to avoid war, it's to improve the odds of winning a war. So if this strategy of sequencing fails, the West may be forced into a global war that it cannot win. According to A Wess Mitchell, quote, "The current state of affairs is gravely dangerous. For 2.5 years, the nations of the West have had before them on full display in Ukraine a foreshadowing of the wastage and ruin that would attend a protracted war with an industrialized power. And yet, US and allied preparations for such a contingency have not amounted to much more than a restocking of the scale of military provisions that we would have needed to face a bit player like Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. Translation, we ain't doing enough, motherfucker." The upshot upshot is that the United States is effectively setting aside its optimal strategy, sequencing, and allowing its opponents to realize their optimal strategy, which is a coordinated or opportunistic run on the bank aimed at overwhelming US allies in multiple theaters. So if strategic sequencing fails in either Ukraine or the Middle East, or both, the US will either need to accept a multipolar world and retreat, or face the challenge of fighting an all-out war on multiple fronts against industrial powerhouses in both Russia and China. Now, if you know the decision makers in Washington, then you'll know the Americans have no intention of retreating. So just understand that every victory in Ukraine, even if it's a small town like Pokrovsk, means another nail in the coffin for the US strategy of sequencing. And failing in this strategy makes the possibility of World War III more and more likely. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Is there anything that I'm missing? If you liked this video, please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And as I mentioned earlier, we are too controversial for sponsors to work with, so we need your support to keep the lights on. So do me a favor, click the link in the description and support our channel, whether it's through a donation or a monthly subscription to our website, where you can gain access to VIP behind-the-scenes content and private interviews with all the guests and academics that you love. Take care of yourselves and see you guys in the next one.
Trust nothing. No